The first thing that caught Megan's eye wasn't the name on the reservation. It was the woman standing in front of her, the kind of presence that made people pause, though not for reasons they could explain without sounding offensive. She was black, mid-40s, no flashy jewelry, no loud colors, no towering heels. Just quiet confidence wrapped in a navy blue trench coat and a soft leather weekender slung over one shoulder. The woman's hair was in a neat, low bun. No entourage, no arrogance, no obvious markers of status. She looked like someone who was used to getting things done without asking for permission, and that made Megan uncomfortable. Her fingers paused mid-keystroke. Something didn't feel right. Not that anything was technically wrong. The card matched the booking. The woman had confirmed everything in calm, clear tones. But Megan didn't need facts to feel suspicious, just instincts. Or, more truthfully, biases disguised as intuition. She leaned slightly to the left, catching the eye of the lobby guard across the room. "Can you hold on a moment?" she said, masking concern with the kind of sweetness reserved for suspected trespassers. The woman raised an eyebrow slightly, sensing the shift. One she'd experienced too many times in too many upscale spaces. She nodded without resistance, stepping slightly to the side as Megan whispered into a headset and flagged a name mismatch. It wasn't just the name that bothered her. It was the idea that someone like her had booked a suite under an alias. Have you ever been judged based on your appearance before you even spoke a word? If you believe discrimination has no place in 2025, hit that subscribe button and share this story, because corporate accountability starts with us refusing to stay silent. Just an hour earlier, Ava Kellerman had stepped off a private red-eye flight from Tokyo with only one goal in mind: rest. The international board meetings had run 2 days over. Strategic partnerships, acquisition talks, diplomacy and power games layered beneath elegant dinners and executive smiles. Ava had navigated it all, as she always did, with precision, patience, and purpose. But now, in the still blue hours before sunrise, she just wanted silence. A moment to breathe before the next round of meetings. She had intentionally avoided attention, traveling without assistants or PR reps. Her alias, Marissa Blake, wasn't deception. It was policy, one used by nearly every executive in her company when traveling under media blackout conditions. What Megan read as suspicious, Ava knew to be protocol. She had stayed at the Valier Regent before. Many times, in fact. Not that anyone at the front desk seemed to remember. Corporate had already handled the clearance. The alias was logged, the reservation verified, her preferences noted down to the pillow firmness. But none of that mattered when someone had already decided you didn't belong. As Ava waited quietly by the desk, she caught glimpses of her reflection in the gilded mirror near the check-in area. The fatigue under her eyes was starting to show. Her clothes were comfortable, functional, not the typical look of someone arriving in the hotel's $1,300 a night orchid suite. That made her invisible in all the wrong ways. Inside the reception system, her file was marked with an executive security flag, one that required discretion. But Megan never clicked the internal note tab. She didn't need more information to build a narrative. To her, this was someone playing games with someone else's booking. Or worse, security stepped closer, posture stiff. The manager hadn't been called. There was no investigation into the system error. Just assumption after assumption, stacked atop a foundation of polite doubt. Ava knew the script, had seen it unfold too many times. In airports, at private banks, even in boardrooms. She could tell when the temperature shifted, when her calmness became suspicious, when her quiet became weaponized against her. The irony was never lost on her. Being unbothered made them more bothered, and so she stood, still, silent, letting it unfold. While Megan gestured toward her earpiece, another guest approached the counter. A white man in joggers and a wrinkled polo shirt. No reservation pulled up, no card on file. Yet within moments he was handed a complimentary room upgrade and a keycard sleeve. Ava saw it. The difference in posture. The ease of grace. She didn't flinch, just watched. 10 minutes later, Megan announced the system was unable to process the booking, and that Ava would have to wait for someone from security to assist. She never mentioned the internal notes. Never read the corporate memo attached to the reservation. Never considered, even briefly, that the woman standing in front of her might not just belong here. She might own the table everyone else was scrambling to sit at. But Ava didn't correct her, didn't name drop, didn't escalate. Instead, she stepped back from the desk, found a quiet armchair in the corner of the lobby, and lowered herself into it. She pulled out her phone, not to call corporate, not to expose the scene, but to send one short message to her assistant. Let them finish the play. She knew the story would flip, but she also knew that true change doesn't begin with fury. It begins with exposure. Outside, the city was just waking up. The sidewalks were damp from a night of rain. Yellow cabs cut between shadows and steam. But inside the lobby of the Voliere Regent, something far colder was unfolding. A silent theater of assumptions, playing out in slow motion. The receptionist didn't recognize the woman before her. The security guard didn't question the instructions. The manager hadn't yet been looped in. But the woman sitting silently in the velvet chair, eyes half closed, posture regal despite exhaustion, wasn't just a guest with a glitchy booking. She was the CEO of the firm that had just completed a silent acquisition of the parent company that owned the Voliere Regent and 37 other properties like it. The paperwork wasn't public yet, but it would be. And by the time it was, everyone in this lobby would remember exactly how they treated the woman whose name they didn't bother to read. Suspicion doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, low enough to be denied, but loud enough to alter outcomes. As Ava Kellerman sat quietly in the lobby's velvet chair, the scent of jasmine from a nearby diffuser barely masked the tension thickening around her. The room's polished luxury, the marble pillars, the Art Deco chandeliers, the concierge with white gloves, couldn't hide what was unfolding. A slow, deliberate erosion of dignity, masked by politeness. The security guard, now stationed near the desk but trying to appear casual, kept glancing in her direction. Not with aggression, but with alertness, the kind born not from protocol but from presumption. The kind that asks, why is she here? What's her angle? No one had spoken to Ava directly since the desk clerk's initial brush-off. They simply watched, measured, waited for her to make a move so they could justify their instincts. And still she didn't. She sat with the grace of someone who had nothing to prove and the patience of someone who'd been through worse. But that didn't make the moment any less sharp. Because Ava knew what this was. Not just a misunderstanding. Not just a name mismatch. It was the weight of inherited suspicion, applied without invitation, and impossible to reason with. She had been given no answers. Only distance. Only doubt. From her corner, she could see the front desk bustling again. Megan now smiling for a new couple, this time in athleisure, dragging oversized luggage across the marble tiles. She watched as the clerk laughed, even offered them complimentary champagne flutes while their room was being prepared. No ID verification, no headset whispers, just welcome and warmth. The contrast wasn't subtle. It never was. Ava didn't resent those who were welcomed freely. She resented the system that made warmth conditional. Conditional on complexion. Conditional on assumption. Conditional on compliance with the unspoken dress code of belonging. The minutes dragged. 12, 15, 20. People walked past. Some glanced toward her. Others pretended not to see. One teenage girl whispered to her mother while nodding discreetly in Ava's direction. The mother shook her head, tugged her daughter along. Even without words, Ava could read the cues. She had become the anomaly, the silent disruption, the woman who didn't look like someone who should be sitting alone in a luxury hotel lobby, booked under someone else's name. And that was the power of visual presumption. It rewrites biographies before the first page is turned. Upstairs, unbeknownst to the staff below, the orchid suite remained untouched. Floral arrangements freshly delivered, the blackout curtains drawn, the pillow menu selected in advance. All of it waiting for a guest the system claimed didn't match the name she gave. All of it waiting for the woman currently being quietly surveilled. At one point, a bellhop walked past Ava, pushing an empty brass cart. Their eyes met. His glance flickered, recognition, perhaps, or unease. But he said nothing, just kept walking. That was the danger of institutional suspicion. It taught people to observe, not to intervene. Back at the desk, Megan was now reviewing Ava's reservation with a clipboard in hand, still avoiding the guest herself. Still avoiding the part of the file marked Nevura Executive Security Directive, Confidential Alias Protocol. Instead, she focused on what felt safer, procedure skewed by personal bias. To Megan, the woman who came in alone, who booked under a name that didn't match her ID, who didn't argue when denied, wasn't powerful. She was suspicious, because suspicion is rarely about facts. It's about familiarity. Ava didn't look like the kind of person Megan saw in luxury magazines. She didn't arrive with designer tags or with staff fluttering around her. She didn't offer explanations or beg for reconsideration. She didn't play the part, and that alone was enough. But the real weight, the thing that gnawed quietly at the back of Ava's mind, wasn't personal embarrassment. It was the deep, familiar ache of watching a system run exactly as designed. Watching how quickly people defaulted to distrust when the packaging didn't match expectation. This wasn't just about her. This was about every young black woman who would walk into this lobby after her. Every student from Howard, every entrepreneur from Harlem, every professional trying to book a weekend of peace, who might be met not with welcome, but with evaluation. She knew her silence wouldn't fix it, but it might reveal it, and so she waited. Somewhere, a jazz piano track cycled for the third time through the lobby speakers. A mother with 2 children passed by, ushering them toward the elevators. The security guard scratched his beard and looked over again. Another concierge approached Megan, whispering something about the lady still sitting there. Megan shrugged. The assumption was baked in. If the woman really belonged here, she'd have said something by now. But Ava had said plenty, just not in the language they understood. She had spoken in restraint, in stillness, in patience they didn't recognize as strength. What no one in that lobby knew was that Ava's name had been circulating all day on confidential legal briefs. The Valier Regent's parent company had just finalized a merger with one of Nevura's portfolio firms, part of a quiet restructuring campaign to bring several high-end hospitality chains under a single data infrastructure. Ava wasn't just involved, she orchestrated the deal. And that suite upstairs? It wasn't a complimentary amenity. It was hers in every legal and corporate sense of the word. But now, the suspicion had built its own narrative. A woman arrives under a different name. She matches none of their expectations. She doesn't argue when they push her away. And so she must be wrong. That's how bias works. It doesn't wait for contradiction. It simply fills the silence with convenient fiction. Ava checked her phone again. The response from her assistant was already there. Understood. Legal watching. HR flag raised. Front desk under review. That was enough for now. She leaned back in her chair, legs crossed gently, chin tilted ever so slightly toward the lobby's grand chandelier. Not to admire it, but to remind herself where she was, what she was owed, what she was about to reclaim. No outburst, no reveal, just the truth unfolding in its own time. And when it did, the entire hotel would be forced to confront not just the name on a reservation, but the culture that made them doubt her in the first place. The hum of the lobby dimmed as the hour grew later, but inside the Valier Regent, something quieter and far more dangerous was gathering momentum. Suspicion had already taken root, but now it was being watered by silence, spread by side glances, and nourished by inaction. Ava Kellerman still sat quietly in the corner of the grand lobby, posture composed, phone resting and used beside her. She hadn't asked for assistance again. She hadn't protested. She hadn't even shifted her expression. Yet somehow, her calm seemed to unsettle them more than confrontation would have. Security remained nearby, not in a way that demanded presence, but in that calculated, hovering kind of way, circling just enough to be noticed, just enough to maintain plausible deniability. To anyone else, it might have looked like due diligence. To Ava, it looked like surveillance. The receptionist had done her part, alerted management, filed a non-verbal complaint via headset, and quietly told the concierge that a non-verified guest was loitering. What she hadn't done was check the flagged note on Ava's booking file. That small oversight, born from assumption, would soon prove costly. But for now, it was still growing quietly. 35 minutes had passed. Ava had yet to be formally spoken to. She wasn't escorted out. She wasn't offered a resolution. She was simply contained, left in the ambiguity between mistaken identity and presumed threat. And in that ambiguity, reputation became fiction. Across the room, the lobby cameras captured every angle, her composed posture, the glances she received, the moments the receptionist gestured toward her with subtle but suspicious energy. There was no yelling, no conflict, just a narrative built on posture and silence. That's how power works when wielded unfairly. It doesn't need facts, only suggestion. A young man, mid-20s, entered the lobby carrying a duffel bag. He stopped abruptly when he noticed Ava seated beneath the lobby's ornate wall sconces, flanked loosely by security staff pretending not to stare. The man hesitated, then subtly reached into his jacket pocket and hit record on his phone. He didn't know the full story, but something about the optics felt wrong. Too familiar, too quiet to be innocent. The phone's lens captured the scene. A black woman seated alone, security circling, the receptionist whispering. No raised voices, just tension and history, playing out again like it always does. The footage would later matter. But for now, it simply documented what too often goes unseen. Upstairs, the Orchid Suite still waited. Turn down service completed. Welcome card displayed on the nightstand. Fruit platter untouched. It was hers. Yet no one downstairs had the decency to verify it. Instead, a new manager arrived on shift. His name was Alan. Clean-shaven, late 40s, crisp navy suit, and the kind of gait that suggested confidence bred from corporate ladders, not empathy. Megan handed him a clipboard, summarized the incident, and pointed discreetly toward Ava. She's saying her name's something else, Megan explained, glossing over the truth. Doesn't match the ID she gave. Alan nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. Another one of those situations, he thought. He approached the front desk monitor, pulled up the file, and paused when he saw the red-tagged security note beside the alias Marissa Blake. But instead of clicking it open, he minimized the box. A mental shortcut. Guests trying to game the system never had flagged profiles. The message must have been a glitch. So he did what the system had taught him to do. He ignored it. He signaled for security to engage. Within minutes, a second guard joined the first. Together, they approached Ava's corner, flanking her like bouncers closing in on an uninvited guest. There were no raised voices, no demands, only cold protocol. The lead guard made a show of needing to verify her reason for being there. He asked her to stand. She did, calmly, gracefully, without resistance. Then came the questions. Her name, her booking confirmation, her ID. Ava provided all of it with practiced ease. She knew the drill, knew the mechanics of deflection dressed as due diligence. The guards frowned at the mismatch. The name she gave, Marissa Blake, didn't match her government-issued ID. That was the moment they made their decision. Not because they were certain of wrongdoing, but because they had seen enough to justify action to themselves. And so they asked her to leave. The lobby fell into a strange hush. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. Something wasn't right. Yet no one intervened. Because when suspicion wears a uniform, it's hard to challenge. Ava didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or demand to see the manager. She simply asked if they were refusing service to a confirmed guest. No answer. Just a blank stare and a stiff nod toward the revolving door. The same door she had walked through 45 minutes earlier without a single misstep. Now it was her exit. She picked up her weekender bag, adjusted her coat, and walked out. Unrushed, unshaken, but not unaffected. Because no matter how powerful you are, disrespect still bruises. Outside, the Manhattan night pulsed with energy. Horns echoed through avenues. Headlights sliced through fog. But in the middle of it all, Ava stood still. For a moment, The weight of it all settled on her shoulders. Not the insult, not the inconvenience, but the realization that even at the height of her career, her dignity was still considered negotiable. Still dependent on someone else checking the right box. Still vulnerable to someone else's suspicion. Back inside, Megan returned to her station, smug in her resolve. Alan wrote a note in the guest log, describing the event as attempted identity misuse. And in doing so, the story was sealed. Or so they thought. Because what they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that the guest they had just escorted out didn't just belong in the hotel. She owned the building, metaphorically and soon quite literally. Her company, Nuvura Holdings, had finalized a quiet but sweeping merger with the hospitality group that oversaw the Valier Regent brand. By Monday, Ava Kellerman's name would be inked onto the highest executive documents as a stakeholder with final say on operational standards across all North American properties. But tonight, she said nothing. Because the truest power doesn't always roar. It sometimes lets the world speak first, so the correction becomes impossible to ignore. Power doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it waits in the shadows, silent, surgical, and patient. When Ava Kellerman stepped outside the Valier Regent that night, she didn't slam the door or demand apologies. She didn't call a lawyer or threaten legal action on the sidewalk. She simply disappeared into the Manhattan darkness like a name no one bothered to learn, leaving behind only confusion and the fragile illusion of victory. But the truth? The real storm had already begun. Inside the hotel, the shift manager returned to his back office, updating a few internal notes on the incident. Guest refused to verify identity, he typed, mislabeling Ava as a security concern. He didn't bother attaching evidence. He didn't click the red-marked corporate flag on her booking profile. If he had, he might have seen the entire thing unravel before it started. That flag was never meant to be ignored. It was a high-alert classification reserved for sensitive figures. Executives, diplomats, or individuals with personal security protocols. Attached to that flag were 3 pages of internal memos from the corporate security division of Nuvura Holdings. But no one clicked. No one looked. No one cared to ask why the booking came from an alias, because once they decided Ava didn't belong, the facts were just noise. By sunrise, the mistake was irreversible. A front office email pinged at 6:03 a.m., just as Megan clocked back in for her next shift. It came from the Regional Operations Director. Subject line: Urgent. Confirmed VIP flagged guest escalation. CEO Ava Kellerman. She didn't recognize the name. That's because she never knew it. To her, the guest was Marissa Blake, a name she had filed under questionable and suspicious. The body of the email was brief. A guest removed from the property under suspicious pretenses had been verified, post-incident, to be the CEO of Nuvura, the firm currently leading the acquisition and restructuring of their hotel group. Ava wasn't just a VIP. She was, in effect, their future boss. Megan froze, the screen's glow reflecting off her pale face. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. A memory flashed. Ava standing in front of her. Calm but firm, the name Marissa rolling off her tongue. Megan had dismissed her, had flagged her, had humiliated her, all while Ava had said nothing. She hadn't needed to, because Ava's silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. By 9 a.m., the footage from the lobby had already circulated through several internal Slack channels. Employees whispered about it in break rooms. Someone had forwarded a clip recorded by a guest, the one who had sensed something wasn't right and had quietly filmed the exchange. The footage was damning. No yelling, no fraud, just a well-dressed black woman, quietly questioned, quietly surveilled, quietly removed. The internet doesn't need drama to demand justice. It only needs truth. And this truth had video evidence, metadata, and now a name. In a downtown boardroom, Ava sat across from her legal team and 2 executives from the hospitality group. She hadn't asked for revenge. She had asked for review. The merger, which had been confidential until that morning, was now public. Nuvura Holdings had officially acquired controlling interest in Lucent Stays International, the luxury chain that operated 38 properties across the U.S., including the Valier Regent. Ava didn't need to threaten anyone. She simply presented facts. The hotel's general manager was already on a flight in for emergency damage control. The front desk staff had been temporarily reassigned while the incident was investigated. But no amount of internal panic could undo the reality. They had profiled and removed the woman signing their paychecks. Still, Ava remained quiet. She issued no statement, no tweet, no press conference. But that silence only intensified the public response. Screenshots of her LinkedIn profile circulated. Clips of her keynote speeches began trending. Hashtag Ava Kellerman and hashtag corporate bias began climbing the algorithm. And suddenly, the story wasn't about a misunderstanding. It was about a mirror being held up to an industry and a world still governed by reflexes of exclusion. The story wasn't Ava's to control anymore. It had become a movement. Across LinkedIn and X, formerly Twitter, professionals of color began sharing similar stories under the hashtag mistaken guest. Stories of being denied upgrades, escorted out of lounges, mistaken for staff at their own conferences. Ava had said nothing, but in saying nothing, she had ignited something louder than outrage, solidarity. Meanwhile, inside the Voliere Regent, the cracks deepened. The regional HR director arrived on site by mid-morning to interview staff. The security footage was pulled. So were internal logs, headset transcripts, and Megan's initial statements. Every moment was time-stamped, every assumption recorded, and none of it was defensible. Not when the flagged memo had been ignored. Not when the staff had failed to follow protocol. Not when the guest they humiliated turned out to be the very person reshaping their corporate future. By noon, the hotel's parent company issued a formal internal memo to all staff. We are currently reviewing an incident involving a high-profile guest who was not treated in alignment with our brand's values. We are committed to addressing this breakdown with transparency and accountability. The email was vague, but the meaning wasn't. Everyone knew who the guest was now. Everyone knew what had happened, and everyone knew what it meant. That afternoon, Ava sat alone in a quiet office overlooking the city. She didn't look triumphant. She wasn't smiling. There was no satisfaction in being proven right, because the pain wasn't in the incident, it was in its predictability. She hadn't been surprised, and that was the problem. This wasn't a one-off moment. It was a symptom, a microcosm of how quickly people still judged power by appearance. How often professionalism was mistaken for passivity. How rarely people paused to check their assumptions. She didn't want an apology. She wanted the entire system to change. In the days to come, the footage would hit national media. Corporate sponsors would speak out. Diversity councils would hold emergency town halls. But Ava? She would remain where she had always been. Calm, composed, unbothered. Not because she wasn't hurt, but because she had long learned how to turn injury into influence and bias into blueprint. The Voliere Regent lobby looked the same the next morning. Gilded, hushed, polished to a shine. But beneath the marble and chandeliers, the atmosphere had changed. Not visibly, but deeply. The staff moved with a certain tension, like dancers afraid to misstep. Smiles were more cautious. Conversations shorter. Silence lingered just a second longer than usual after every guest interaction. Because they all knew. The whisper had traveled fast. Much faster than the hotel's formal apology ever would. The guest who had been quietly escorted out the night before had returned. Not in person, but in reputation, headlines, and corporate memos. She was the new face they couldn't ignore, and the judgment they could no longer hide behind. The security team had been pulled from public areas that morning, rotated for retraining, according to the shift board. But everyone knew that wasn't the full story. Internal footage had been reviewed, audio transcripts extracted from headset logs, and every moment, the glances, the whispers, the decision to ignore protocol was documented. There was no yelling, no slurs, just quiet, traceable bias. The kind that doesn't need to be loud to be devastating. HR representatives had flown in from headquarters. Megan, the receptionist, had been called into a meeting room on the second floor. She'd applied extra concealer that morning, though nothing could mask the nerves. She sat across from 3 executives and a compliance officer who did not make small talk. In the room, they walked her through the timeline. The decision not to read the profile note. The failure to follow the alias protocol listed in staff training. The unnecessary alert to security. Then, the words that came next weren't cruel. They were just final. And as she exited through the staff doors, her name badge no longer clipped to her blouse, she realized that the real damage hadn't been done to the hotel. It had been done by it. The clip of Ava's removal, subtle, steady, quiet, had now amassed 3.6 million views on social media. But it wasn't the video that stung most. It was the comments. Executives shared their own stories. Flight attendants described guests mistaking black pilots for baggage handlers. Harvard grads posted photos of being followed around luxury stores. Corporate consultants told of being questioned at the doors of conferences they were scheduled to speak at. And each one of those stories pointed back to one truth. Appearances, not merit, still decided how people were treated. Within Nevura's headquarters, Ava watched the storm unfold without reacting publicly. She had no need to explain. The world had connected the dots on its own. But behind closed doors, she moved swiftly. An internal audit was launched across all 38 properties of the hospitality group. Each flagged guest complaint from the past 3 years was reopened. Each racial bias training program was suspended and rewritten. And each executive received a memo. Quiet failure is still failure. If we build a business that treats protocol as optional, we deserve to fall beneath the weight of our own negligence. It didn't read like revenge. It read like restructuring. Meanwhile, corporate sponsors who had previously partnered with the Valier Regent brand began pulling back. A luxury travel app removed the property from its featured listings. A Fortune 100 company publicly canceled its leadership retreat, citing recent troubling behavior inconsistent with our values. It wasn't just about a hotel anymore. It was about a culture exposed. In the employee cafeteria, staff whispered about what might come next. Would there be firings? Would management change? Would training now include a real conversation, not just a slideshow on diversity? One housekeeper, who had worked silently at the hotel for 12 years, whispered to a colleague. She didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't try to prove anything. And she still made the whole world listen. Ava hadn't planned for the story to go viral. She didn't want pity, or applause, or vengeance. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was standards. Not just policies printed in staff manuals, but actions. The kind that weren't dependent on whether someone looked like they belonged. She remembered being 24, a first-year analyst, watching a senior executive be denied access to a corporate retreat breakfast because he wasn't in a suit. She remembered the way he had laughed it off to save face, then spent the whole day avoiding eye contact with anyone who had seen it. Ava had promised herself that day, if I ever sit at the top, I'll make sure the door opens fully. Not just for me, but for the ones who come after. Now she was at the top, and the door had tried to close on her anyway. That made the mission even clearer. Within 2 weeks, Ava established a new mandate under Nevura's hospitality division. All staff would undergo live scenario-based bias simulations, monitored and recorded. All high-alert profile guests using aliases would be cross-verified using a secure authentication line. Mandatory. A guest dignity clause would be added to employee contracts, with disciplinary action for noncompliance. And all performance evaluations for staff in guest-facing roles would include bias response behavior audits. This wasn't performative. It was structural reform written in policy ink and budget lines. And as for the Valier Regent, the location remained open, but the corporate leadership team did not. 3 executives were quietly rotated out. Ava didn't announce it. She didn't have to. Their absences were felt in the quarterly meetings, because sometimes the loudest message is the one without a press release. Weeks later, Ava walked past the hotel again, not to rebook a room, not to confront anyone, just to see it. From across the street, she watched the doorman greet a young couple, laughing. A black woman in an emerald green dress walked confidently into the revolving doors. Unquestioned, unchallenged, unbothered. Ava smiled faintly, not because everything was fixed, but because something had shifted. Quiet resistance had become corporate consequence. Not for revenge, but for legacy. Weeks had passed, but the story refused to fade. It lingered in digital spaces like a slow-burning fire, kept alive not by rage, but by resonance. The moment Ava Kellerman was removed from a hotel lobby under suspicion had triggered something deeper than outrage. It had unlocked stories, hundreds of them. Quiet, buried stories from professionals who had bitten their tongues for years. No one expected Ava to say anything, and for a while she didn't. Not when the first article dropped. Not when the anonymous staff member at the hotel leaked the internal memo. Not even when her name trended alongside hashtags about corporate racism. She had already made her point without a single word. But silence, she knew, is a double-edged sword. It can preserve your power, or it can leave space for others to shape the narrative around you. And Ava had no intention of letting this moment become a spectacle of sympathy. She wanted it to become a blueprint for change. Inside the headquarters of Nuvura, glass walls framed the city skyline. But Ava's attention was focused inward. The boardroom around her was filled with legal counsel, communications officers, and brand advisors, each offering strategies, PR plans, and protective talking points. But Ava didn't need a script. She needed a reason to speak. And when the news broke that the receptionist involved had been offered an interview to tell her side, Ava knew the time had come. This wasn't about one hotel or one staff member. This was about an ecosystem that rewarded discretion while failing the dignified. It was time to speak, not for vindication but for clarity. When the interview was announced, no one expected it to be subdued. The media prepared for fireworks. Social feeds braced for another viral soundbite. But what arrived instead was something else entirely. A chair, a single camera, and Ava. No crowd, no applause, no dramatics, just presence. She didn't speak with fury. She didn't recount every detail. She didn't relive the humiliation for the world's consumption. She talked about pattern, about how leadership without empathy was hollow, about how power meant nothing if the systems it oversaw still failed the people at the margins. She described the moment in the lobby not as an anomaly, but as a confirmation of something she had long suspected, that respect in corporate spaces was still conditional. Viewers didn't expect to cry watching a corporate CEO speak, but they did. Not because her words were loud, but because they were honest. She spoke of walking into boardrooms and being mistaken for catering, of being praised for how well she spoke after delivering multi-billion-dollar investment strategy briefings, of mentoring younger professionals who were taught to smile through insult because that's just how it is. She wasn't telling her story. She was telling theirs. That interview became the most watched corporate video in Nuvura's history. But its impact wasn't measured in clicks. It was measured in action. Within days, Fortune 500 companies began publicly reviewing their hospitality vendor partnerships. DEI panels issued new standards for executive travel protocol. HR departments added scenario-based bias training to their staff onboarding programs. And Ava? She didn't stop at reflection. She moved into reformation. She announced a new initiative, the Blake Protocol, named after the alias she had used the night of the incident. It wasn't a charity. It wasn't a PR shield. It was a standard, one backed by funding, policy, and executive oversight. The Blake Protocol would offer mandatory dignity audits for all luxury hotel staff in the Nuvura network, independent reporting systems for guests who experience bias while traveling, executive sponsorship for underrepresented professionals entering the hospitality industry, quarterly bias response evaluations tied directly to vendor contracts, and most importantly, a shift from checking boxes to changing behavior. Other companies followed, quietly at first, then publicly, because Ava hadn't shamed them. She had modeled the alternative. She hadn't demanded apologies. She had demanded better. Months after the interview, a letter arrived at Ava's office, handwritten, from a former hotel employee. It wasn't an apology. It was a confession. The writer had seen what happened that night. had known it was wrong, had stayed silent because fear makes cowards of even good people. The letter ended with a line Ava would never forget. You reminded me that doing nothing is still doing something. I won't choose silence again. Change doesn't come when one person demands it. It comes when enough people decide that silence is no longer safety. And Ava had become the quiet permission others needed to speak up. By the end of that fiscal year, Navura saw a 27% increase in executive-level applications from Black and Indigenous professionals. Employee engagement tripled, and 2 partner hotel chains reached out to implement their own version of the Blake Protocol. Ava didn't celebrate the numbers. She looked at the people behind them, because for every story that came forward, there were 10 that never would. She hadn't created a movement. She'd simply revealed it, and as the world applauded her restraint, her grace, her vision, Ava never lost sight of the reason she began this in the first place. Not for revenge, not for redemption, but for the young woman still learning to hold her head high in places built to make her feel small. She wanted her to know, you don't have to shrink to be safe. You don't have to shout to be heard. You only have to keep standing until the room learns how to see you properly. Time has a way of smoothing out sharp edges, softening the noise, and making once explosive moments feel like quiet echoes in the distance. News cycles move on. Social feeds refresh. But every so often, a story lingers, not because of its scandal but because of its truth. Ava Kellerman's story became one of those. It didn't remain about a hotel or a hostile lobby encounter. It evolved, slowly and powerfully, into something larger. It became a mirror, one held up to the polished face of corporate culture, exposing the cracks that had long been accepted as design. The clip of Ava sitting calmly while security loomed nearby is still watched in leadership trainings around the world. Not as a case study in customer service failure, but as a lesson in invisible grace, how strength doesn't always need to defend itself loudly. Her interview is now required viewing in several business schools, introduced not with fanfare, but with silence. Professors don't lead with Ava's titles or accomplishments. They begin with the video, the moment of dismissal, before revealing the identity of the woman who was told to leave. The lesson always lands harder that way. Across the hospitality industry, things did begin to shift. Some changes were small, a rewritten protocol, a sensitivity workshop redesigned with lived experience in mind. Others were more permanent. Hotels reevaluated their employee review systems. Vendors began prioritizing dignity audits alongside profitability reports. More importantly, leadership began listening to the stories that had once been dismissed as anecdotes. The Blake Protocol became a gold standard, not because it was flashy, but because it worked. Created a paper trail where silence once lived. It held people accountable without spectacle. It removed the excuse of ignorance. And it all began because one woman refused to let a quiet act of disrespect vanish into another uneventful day. But Ava never allowed the story to orbit around her forever. She stepped back from the headlines. She returned to her work. She poured herself into mentoring rising leaders from underrepresented backgrounds, not with speeches but with access. Invitations, introductions, recommendations written not from obligation, but from belief. At one private event, a young woman stood nervously in the corner of a leadership networking mixer. She didn't have the pedigree, didn't know anyone in the room. But when Ava crossed the floor and greeted her first, everything shifted. That woman would later go on to lead a product launch that disrupted the renewable energy market. In her first press interview, she didn't quote tech trends or market share. She quoted Ava Kellerman's interview. Respect should not be earned after credentials. It should be the starting point. Back at the Valier Regent, things changed too. The staff rotated. Policies updated. A new manager arrived, young, progressive, with a background in restorative justice. But the building remained the same. The marble, the chandeliers, the gold-accented elevators. All still gleamed as if nothing had ever happened. But the energy had changed. Not out of fear. Out of awareness. One evening, nearly a year after the incident, Ava returned. She didn't announce her arrival. No formal booking. No entourage. This time, She walked through the lobby just as quietly as the last. Only now, the reception desk staff stood a little taller. Eyes widened with recognition not of a celebrity, but of a moment they had studied, dissected, learned from. A manager stepped forward, not to block her path, but to offer welcome, genuine and unpracticed. Ava didn't linger. She smiled, nodded, and continued walking, not toward a suite, just through the space that had once tried to shrink her. There was no bitterness in her walk, just memory, and a reminder that places, like people, are capable of change if you give them a reason to. Elsewhere, in communities and classrooms far beyond that hotel, Ava's story lived on. Not just in corporate circles, but in dinner-table conversations, student debates, and grassroots workshops led by those who knew all too well what it felt like to be seen only after being doubted. Her story reminded them they were not alone. That grace under pressure is not weakness. That refusing to shout doesn't mean surrender. That one moment, one encounter, can ripple outward if you allow your silence to be strategic, not submissive. Legacy, Ava knew, wasn't about what you owned. It was about what you left behind in other people. A shift in perspective. A new standard. A small voice that says, I belong. And finally, someone listens. A framed quote now hangs in the executive wing of Navura's headquarters. It's not flashy, just simple white text on black. It reads, when they couldn't see who I was, I didn't make them look harder. I made the room change its definition of success. Underneath is Ava's name, etched not in gold, but in glass, because her story was never about vengeance. It was about transparency and transformation. If the story moved you, made you think, or reminded you of a time you were judged before you ever got to speak, don't let it end here. Comment below and share your thoughts. Hit that subscribe button to support stories that shine a light on quiet resistance and meaningful change. This isn't just a story about a CEO. It's a story about all of us and the world we choose to build next.